classes. I've been recording for about a month. So although I've been teaching this for a couple of years, but so earlier classes, 30 or 40 of them are on a YouTube channel. If you Google me on YouTube, you'll probably find it, or I can send a link. Okay, so in just a quick sort of background, in the mid teens of the 19th century, 1810, 1815, 1819, the reform movement begins to really develop. And in Berlin, there's a reform minion, essentially, that reform service that comes together. It seems like in the mid-teens. And then by 1819, there's the Hamburg Temple that is built, a very big temple. And obviously their traditions that they want to instate are different. They essentially want to change certain things about tefillah. They want to do prayer in German. They want to have an organ in the synagogue. They want to get rid of the silent Amidah. They want to keep the out loud Amidah, the public chazan's repetition, but they want to get rid of the silent Amidah. There's other things that they do that we've looked at. For instance, they move the bima to the front. They put women on a balcony instead of behind a wall or in a different room. The chazan wears a robe. There's a choir. There's a steeple on top of the synagogue. So those things are things that come up later, because mostly later in the 19th century, because there's a whole list in 1852. There's sort of this thing called the Psak Din that the Chassam Sofer heads up, of things that Orthodox synagogues you cannot go into. You cannot go into an Orthodox synagogue where the chazan wears a robe, or where there's a choir, or where the bima's in the front, or where the women and men could see each other, even though they're on a different floor behind the mechitza, where it has a steeple. All these things that the Reform did that get forbade by the rabbis of Hungary. But that really kind of happens in the 1850s. In the teens, what we really have is a very early process, and that's what's interesting about it. The early reformers are coming from a halachic point of view, and their arguments for change, and basically the main things they want to change are the language of prayer, getting rid of the silent Amidah, and bringing the organ in. Those are that's what's going on in 1819, and so they they already know that there's opposition, or there's going to be opposition to change, and so they kind of jump the gun with a book called Noga HaTzedek, and that is, the early reformers send letters to Orthodox rabbis, what we would call Orthodox rabbis. But, just like today, everything's a spectrum. That's what you realize, is how similar this is to today. A lot of this is going to sound like arguments that people have today. So they don't send it to the Chassam Sofer saying, do you think we could change the language of public prayer to German? They send it to four rabbis in particular, a rabbi in Verona, a rabbi in Livorno, a rabbi named Rabbi Moshe Kunitz, who's in Eastern Europe, and a rabbi named Rabbi Aaron Chorin of Erd, who is in Hungary. Because they know that those rabbis are going to have a more open-minded approach. And this is published in Dessau in 1818. And so we've been looking at this book. There's a response to this book less than a year later from the Hamburg Bezdin. It's a very large book of basically letters against the reformers or these reformations. What's interesting is the method that everybody uses for the most part. And then there's books back and forth. There's another book then back pro-reform and another book back anti-reform. We have the back and forth. But what's kind of interesting is that at least part of what we've seen is that the reformers use halakhic methodology, because the truth is that the Shulchan Aruch says you can pray in any language. And some of the Mefarshim, the Magen Avram, say a private person should not pray in any language. They should only pray in Hebrew because you want to get your prayers heard. But a congregation praying publicly, yeah, they could pray in any language. The organ in a synagogue, there's lots of arguments for that, even on Shabbat, even going back into the 17th century. And in Shulchan Aruch itself, as we've mentioned, it says you can hire a non-Jewish band to play on Shabbos in the shul, if you're having a Shabbat Chatan or something like that. So there is precedence for lots of these things. The rabbis of Hamburg who are responding, the rabbis of Hungary who are responding, obviously they need to take a slightly different approach. They're not just going to argue it halakhically. What they are arguing, of course, is a much bigger picture, slippery slope issue. I mean, it just sounds so much like the question of, women rabbis in Orthodoxy today, in which, what's halakhically wrong with it? Nothing. What is wrong with it? Everything. Right? In other words, culturally and slippery slope and tradition. And I mean, it just sounds very familiar. So what the right decision is, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting thing. Now, when you look back here, right, you might say, oh, thank God we put up a bulwark against reform. On the other hand, you might say, well, if the Chassam Sofer had said to the Hamburg temple, yeah, it's okay to have prayer in German, and it's okay. I'm glad you have a mechitza. It's okay that the men and women could see each other. The women are on a balcony. You want to have an organ? Yeah, there is precedence for that. Had they said that, I don't know what would have happened. Do we think that things would have reformed faster? Definitely not, because things reformed mighty quickly. Maybe the other possibility is that the Jews would have stayed more traditional. Maybe they would have stayed one community. No one knows, obviously, but I don't think that you can necessarily conclude one way or the other, and necessarily obviously in our own minds we would like to take instruction for today. But so we've been focusing for the last couple of classes on the question of abrogation of the silent Amidah, and in Noga HaTzedek, it's addressed by several of the people. They also don't seem to really ask the questions all in the same way. For instance, the question that they asked to the Italian rabbi of Rabbi Riccanati is, all they ask him is, in Verona, do they pray out loud or silently? That's all they ask him. And he answers, well, until Baruch Hu, we all pray out loud. When we get to Baruch Hu, the Shliach Tzibur, everybody sits down until Baruch Hu. This is a common Sephardic practice. And we do it all out loud together, Psuket Zimra. And then when the Chazan gets he goes up there at Baruch Hu, he wears special clothing. And so we see that he's separate from the Kahal. And he prays until Gal Yisrael, and then we pray silently. So they didn't ask him, is it okay to, it didn't sound like they asked him, is it okay to get rid of the silent Amidah? They just asked him, what do you do in Italy? I guess hoping for something more creative. And they also ask him how many shuls are there, because one of the criticisms of the Hamburg temple was that they're going to create division among the Jewish people in Hamburg. Do they pray in Italian? And he says, no, he's like very traditional. He doesn't really know what he's being asked. I don't think he really realizes what's going on here with the Reform movement. And they ask him about an organ, and then he kind of answers halachically about the organ, and has some worry about Avodah Zarah, but basically says, he sort of lays out the issues. Okay. But is not so strong about any of it. And then, actually just look back here. Can you use an organ or not? Anochi haroa asher she'ela zot kavanas l'shosh dima. I think this is dependent on three things. The first one is, do you have to worry about using an instrument because of Vodad Zarah, right? Imitating the Christians. Obviously, if you're in Italy, you know about the Christians. and that depends on whether it's something that other people use or whether it's just something Christians use. Is it a problem because you're not allowed to play instruments after the destruction of the temple? He sort of lays it out, but doesn't really give much psak about it. And does it take away kavana? He doesn't think that they're asking about doing it on Shabbat. In fact, the Chassam Sofer even seems to allow it on a weekday when he's asked about it in the book of the Hamburg Bezdin, but not on Shabbat. He has a longer answer here, which I think we did before. Mostly quoting Shulchan Aruch, which does allow it. Which we could go into, although I think we did this already. So we were up to, we were looking at the response of Rabbi, the Av Bezdin of Erd, Rabbi Aaron Chorin, who there's a big argument about how much of a reformer is he or not. And I was saying yesterday that he's pretty pro-reform in this letter. And then we'll see that the Chassam Sofer makes him recant in the next book. And we were up to here. Harambam, so here he's talking about getting rid of the silent Amidah, whether you can do that or not. And why did Anshe Knesset Hagadola establish the silent Amidah? So he says, we'll just go back a paragraph. Milan Gadol Poskim Hilchos for some Chassidim Midatim Minaga Yisrael Yosem Arav. But he says the Magen Avram, was very careful about customs of the Jewish people, and other people were also. And we have, it writes in Sefer Chassidim, Tov lo la'adam she'ispal v'yikari et shema b'chus b'lashon shmevin. She'ispal b'lashon hakodesh v'enamevin. Oh, here he's talking about praying in German, in the vernacular, and he says you should pray in a language you understand. You shouldn't. So that we've seen, that there seems to be grounds for praying in a language that you understand, certainly in a communal setting. You can understand the opposite argument also. Obviously, the argument of the Chassam Sofer back and others is going to be, no, that was never meant as a permanent thing. Okay, and here we have Rambam Parak Alf Tefillah. The Rambam says in the first parak of the laws of Tefillah, when the Jewish people were exiled in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, they became mixed, they became exiled to Persia and Greece. They had children in those lands. And the languages were mixed up. And everybody had different languages. And the Jewish people, the Rambam says, were not eloquent because their languages had become mixed up. They weren't eloquent in one language. Ella b'shibush. Their languages were not very were mixed up. He quotes Pas to prove that. And therefore, when they started to pray very short. They just, they weren't eloquent. They were just asked for their needs, or they weren't very good at being poetic about praising God. Ezra Bezdin. So when Ezra and his Bezdin saw this, they were mitakein yudchet brachot. That's why they created the Amidah. The first 3 brachot are to praise God. The last 3 brachot are to thank God, and the middle ones are to ask for our needs, because the Gemara says you have to have those 3 elements in prayer. They established this in order that it would be everybody would have prayer that is set and established and poetic. So that tefillah would be, that's the Rambam, that tefillah would be consistent, whole, well composed. So here he makes the argument. He says, you see from this Rambam that if the people of the generation had the ability, this is wild, right? It's not a crazy idea. He says, you see from the way the Rambam describes it, that if the Jewish people had the ability to be eloquent in Persian or in Greek, then it sounds like Chazal would not have established prayer, the Amidah in Hebrew. They would have allowed people to pray in any language. That is part, that it does sound like that from the Rambam. They wouldn't have been mitaking the tefillah as we have it. Because the people at that time were exiled and they were not poetic in their own languages. And also they didn't know how to be poetic and to compose in Hebrew. And you have to know what the prayers mean. And that's why he says the Anshe Knesset Hagadola made tefillah in Hebrew and in the structure that they did. But of course, he says they made it that on the condition that you should know what it means. Not that you should just do it, from Baal Peh. They wanted, the Anshe Chesed Gadola wanted everybody to do it so that it was familiar and flows and it's poetic. And that you should know what it means. Right? You can see where he's going. He says, obviously, you have to know what prayer means. And they only did it because nobody was able to compose in their local language. And he shouldn't do it just by heart without kavanah. Because the whole point of prayer, he says, is to fear God. Gadol HaTalmud, right? You could see, this is interesting, right? He's an Orthodox rabbi who's also a reformer. There's a big argument about whether he's Orthodox or Reformed, this rabbi. He's sort of both. Gadol HaTalmud Shemevile Demaisik Moshe Chatam B'Mikvah V'Shem B'Lassos. So he's making an argument, obviously, for prayer in the vernacular. Uvinyana Ein Ish Sam Alev Lassos Kedas L'Tekanish Ezra. Ezra didn't want us to just say it with our mouths, he wanted us to have kavanah. And he says the truth is most people today just pray with their mouths. Okay. This is his argument for tefillah in any language. It's not crazy. And he says, then he quotes all the things from Shulchan Aruch that tefillah could be in any language. So this is a little bit different. It's very interesting to compare this to Rabbi Moshe Kunitz, who is the letter right after this. Because if you remember, he had basically argued I think he had argued, he was less reform. And so he had, or maybe we'll compare this to that tomorrow. We'll just go, we had looked at Rabbi Moshe Kunitz, maybe we'll just go back to it because I think their paths are different. I think you can see that one of them is more open-minded than the other. I think he was opposed actually to changing the language to German. I think that's what he had said. He certainly was opposed to getting rid of the silent Amidah. All right, so we'll kind of compare the two letters a little bit. And I also wanted to get to the part, I do also want to focus on the getting rid of silent Amidah part. We haven't really done that yet. Okay, but then we'll also look at, after we do a little bit of his letter, then we'll look at what Chassam Sofer says. There's sort of this whole letter from the Chassam Sofer in which he says, I got this guy to recant, and then there's a response back. So we'll see some of that. All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.